Welcome everyone to FemQuant's 5-year anniversary event on looking back, looking forward. My name is Sara Rose Taylor. I am part of FemQuant's organizing collective, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. During today's discussion, we will be looking back at exciting innovations and promising developments made in quantitative feminist research over time, as well as the challenges that we have faced along the way. We'll also look forward to new directions and exploring new opportunities for feminist quantitative research. Before I introduce our panelists and kick off our discussion, I'd like to provide a few brief opening remarks just to set the scene. So as many of you are familiar, FemQuant is a network of researchers across the social sciences. Our goal is to explore the ways in which researchers are using feminist theory and motivations in current quantitative empirical research. The network provides opportunities for researchers to discuss and debate the possibilities for feminist quantitative social science, as well as to learn from each other's successes and difficulties in integrating feminist theory with quantitative methods. So today we celebrate 5 years of our network's efforts. It all started with a workshop in London, UK in September 2017. And I remember very clearly stumbling upon the call for papers for the workshop, and I immediately pulled together a submission. I dropped everything. I was so excited. I was a PhD candidate at the time working here in Canada, and I was feeling a bit adrift as kind of the only person in my own network who was combining feminist and quantitative research simultaneously. And while my PhD committee was very supportive of me and my work, they weren't doing the same things. They either took quantitative or feminist approaches separately. So finding FemQuant was really an important point in my career. And I'm so glad that I was part of that workshop back in 2017 and have been in the mix ever since. So since that workshop, FemQuant has grown into a network of researchers. We've offered a series of conferences and seminars. We held a workshop on the gender data gap back in 2019, and then a conference on going beyond the binary variable in 2021. And we've had the opportunity to learn from a wide variety of scholars over the years at those events, as well as in our online seminar series. We also have a listserv as a way to share opportunities with each other. So it's been a lot of fun over the past 5 years. To mark the occasion, today we're meeting for a discussion around the themes of looking back and looking forward in relation to what it means to take a feminist approach to quantitative research in the social sciences. So today's event features a moderated panel discussion featuring 6 fantastic scholars who I will introduce momentarily. I have a list of questions for our panelists today, and I'll be posing some questions to the full panel and other questions to different subsets of the panel. So this is going to keep things pretty dynamic, pretty conversational for an hour-long discussion. And we'll have about 20 minutes afterwards for audience Q&A. So to propose questions, I would like to invite all of our audience members to submit questions through the chat function. Feel free to do so throughout the panel discussion, which will mean we'll have questions ready to go when the Q&A starts. And of course, I would like to remind everyone that we do not tolerate any abusive or discriminatory language, and we reserve the right to remove anyone from the audience on these grounds. As with all of our FemQuant events, please keep your questions respectful. Now that the logistics are out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. So Professor Aliya Saperstein is an associate professor of sociology and Benjamin Scott Crocker professor in human biology at Stanford University. Aliya's research focuses on the social processes through which people come to perceive, name, and deploy seemingly immutable categorical differences, such as race and sex, and how such processes create and maintain social inequality. Dr. Alyasah Ali Sewell is associate professor of sociology at Emory University and affiliated faculty with the African American Studies, and executive director and founder of the Race and Policing Project, a widely published medical sociologist, social psychologist, and research methodologist. They assess the local political economies of racism, medicine, and health disparities, and data equity issues and methodological approaches quantifying police brutality, intersectionality, and systemic racism. Dr. Heini Väisänen is a tenured researcher at the French National Institute for Demographic Research, as well as a part-time lecturer in social statistics and demography at the University of Southampton. Her research spans over various geographical contexts and focuses on population-level sexual and reproductive health topics. Dr. Jaclyn Wong is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and affiliate faculty of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of South Carolina. Her research uses qualitative and quantitative methods to examine gender inequalities in paid and unpaid work within and between couples and families over the life course. Dr. Marion Lieutaud is a research fellow in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics. A sociologist specialized in computational and quantitative methods, Marion studies gender, migration, and inequalities in paid and unpaid labor. Professor Rachel Cohen is a professor in sociology, work, and employment at City University of London. Her research uses mixed methods to explore working lives across different occupations. Rachel has led the establishment of a Q-STEP Center focused on improving the quantitative skills of undergraduate students at City University of London and is a past editor of Radical Statistics. Professor Wendy Sigle is head of the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and teaches courses on social policy and population studies. Wendy has worked on a variety of issues related to family and family policy in historical and contemporary societies. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. We've got a great group here for sure. So we'll start with the kind of first segment of our panel discussion, the looking back portion. And I'd like to start with a question for all of the panelists. If you could please reflect on how the field of feminist quantitative research has evolved over the course of your career. And we'll start with Heini.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the part of the questions was also kind of what were key moments for you? So I'm reflecting this based on that. So I think first key moment for me was when I was trying to figure out a topic for my MSc dissertation many years ago, when I was still living in Finland. And I had studied sociology, gender studies, and statistics, and I wanted to somehow combine all of these things. So I was trying to essentially find a quantitative feminist topic. And I was talking to different professors about different opportunities that I could look into, but I didn't really find that there was a lot of support. So people said things like, well, you can always control for gender, but that was basically it. So in the end, I found this group that was working on sexual and reproductive health. So I decided to write my MSc dissertation on abortion because I thought maybe it's at least a feminist topic. And that's how I ended up in the field of sexual and reproductive health. But I still couldn't really combine feminist theory with my quantitative analysis. And I felt like it was impossible to find any support for that either. So I think the next key moment comes years later in 2017 when we had the first FemQuant conference, where I finally found a group of people who were grappling with these same questions. And that's probably why I ended up joining the network, and now I'm still one of the coordinators of it. So I think I still there's been less involvement than I would ideally like to see, and I still don't always know how to combine feminist theory with quantitative methods, but I feel like at least now I'm not alone asking these questions.
Great. Wendy, we'll turn to you for your thoughts.
I sort of came to feminist theory in a very convoluted way. I went to undergraduate, I studied for my undergraduate degree at Tulane University, and I took a lot of women's studies courses, but my major was economics and my minor was mathematics, and I was never able to put women's studies together with my major and minor. They sort of were parallel interests. And I ended up doing a PhD in economics, where if you did consider gender at all, you included a sex dummy, and then you sort of interpreted it based on your understanding of the context that you were studying. And it really wasn't until I started teaching gender theory after my PhD that I started reading things and then started questioning the methods that I was using. And I don't think that my path is all that different from a lot of other people's. And it's why I don't really think things have changed as much as I would like, because I think a lot of people find the deficiencies in the methods they've been taught by accident. rather than as it being sort of an integral part of their training. And that really disappoints me. I think there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of resources, but the teaching and research and curriculum development has lagged behind more than I would like to see. And it's something I've tried to address in my own teaching.
Certainly resonates with me as an economist. I see the same. Jaclyn, what do you think?
So I don't think I've been in my career for as long as some other folks. And I think that for me, starting as a grad student in 2011 at the University of Chicago, and now being a professor myself, what I've seen the most change is the measurement of gender in quantitative research that I think does a much better job of matching feminist theorizing of gender as fluid and constructed rather than these kind of essential and immutable categories. So, that a lot of that work is thanks to folks like Aliya and Laurel Westbrook. And I think that we still have far to go, but even seeing that develop over my time as a researcher was really exciting.
For sure. Turning now to perfect transition to Aliya.
Thanks for the shout out, Jaclyn. It's funny because I feel like I could tell this story in many different ways. I could tell it in a way where this was always kind of meant to be, and I could tell it in a way where I had to find my way. So I guess I'll tell the I had to find my way version, but I don't know that it's the only one that I could tell. So I think that's worth noting. But I went to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, which anybody in the US has a stereotype about Berkeley, and a quantitative researcher coming out of there, especially 20 years ago, there weren't many women, and there were certainly not thought to be doing feminist theorizing with their work. And so it was kind of an oxymoron. Even the graduate seminar in gender was scheduled at the same time as the required quantitative class. And so my first year, I actually had to choose. I went to the first day of gender, and it was amazing. It was taught by Rock Array, and I was so excited. And then I found out I could skip to the more advanced quantitative class, but it was offered at the same time. And when I chose the quantitative class, it was seen a little bit like, oh, okay, well, she's leaving. She doesn't have interest in gender. She wants to do quantitative work. And so I think perhaps because of that, I was always conscious of trying to bridge those conversations and trying to bring them together rather than seeing them as separate.
That scheduling conflict says a lot. Rachel, over to you.
It's really funny. I hear so many resonances, especially from some of the stuff Aliya was saying, because I did my PhD probably just before you at UCLA, so it wasn't radically different. But for me, I think I became very conscious of the relationship of feminism and quantitative methods when I returned to the UK, and I took up a teaching post, and it was a one-year teaching post. I was there to teach quantitative methods, and then I was going and spending time with the Gender and Women's Studies group, and people were like, but you teach quantitative methods, but like, you shouldn't be here almost, like, why are you here? And so it was interesting that some of my first resistance was from feminists who were saw this as a sort of an antipathy to what they were doing and the present, the understanding of feminism as they had studied it and had researched. And so for me, it kind of raised questions because I was already a mixed methods person, so I'd spent a lot of time thinking about the sort of the different spaces in which different kinds of methods answered questions, both feminist and also my research was in work, and so thinking about the spaces in which we were increasingly having good data about households and in working lives. But it was really, it sort of brought me up short. And so I then started organizing a bunch of events, and I was thinking this is like 10 years before the start of the FemQuant, because it was about 2007. And at that time there was not as much interest, I would say. And sort of, so we had panels, we had an edited special issue called Feminism Counts, in which we were trying to think about like the extent to which there was a conversation between feminists and quantitative researchers, and of feminist quantitative researchers, so both between and, you know, people who identified across. And I think one of the things at that point was it kind of highlighted to me the gaps on both sides. And so the resistance both of quantitative researchers to feminism and the resistance of feminists to quantitative research. And I think that what I've seen in the period since then is some change in that, but you continue to see in a lot of spaces, and we're going to go on to talk about that these remain apart. So I do see progress, because just some of the stuff that you're talking about that you guys have been involved in is really different from 10 years before, but it is still the same questions and issues that are coming up.
Mm-hmm. Marion, what's your take?
Well, I mean, I've not been in academia for very, very long, right? Like I got my PhD last year, so I wouldn't really claim to have the wisdom to say things have changed or they haven't. Like, I did my master's dissertation with someone who is very clearly a feminist quantitative scholar, so I kind of had that as a basis, and I thought that wasn't really an issue. And then I came to LSE for my PhD, and then it seemed like things were a lot more siloed, and you could sort of like have a critical approach to data, and that would allow you to speak with qualitative feminist scholars, or you could do quantitative analysis, and that would allow you to speak to quantitative scholars, but the in-between wasn't very easy to find. And it's only over time that I found people like other PhD students, now other research fellows in social policy and methodology, who are pushing for that, those kind of approach. But I wouldn't be able to tell whether these people, like these spaces, were there before and I only just found them, or whether they gradually emerged. I feel probably both. I do know from I did some archival work on how survey design has evolved on migration and on care labor and unpaid labor. And it's pretty clear that in international surveys and in survey data on migration, we have more overlap, that there's more questions on gender division of labor, more questions on care, also in generalist surveys. It's sort of like gender mainstreaming. So that seems like an evolution, but it's not one that I've experienced myself. I just documented it.
And Alyasah, your reflections, please.
I think there has been a interest in moving forward. I think the technicalities of it is about the data, and what kind of data, particularly thinking about small group comparisons. And that's a quantitative problem anyways. And what I can say is, at least when I started and wanted to go to graduate school, I would have never done this work, because I was like, there's no way that you can be responsible with quantitative work and making these comparisons, particularly in sexually marginalized groups. And the benefit that I have of graduating is that it's been easier and much more welcome to find funding, in particular, to do this work. And you still have the challenge of doing it responsibly. But I do think at least there is a concerted cohort of people who are willing to support these efforts. And Aliya, it is exactly what you're saying. It's like, oh, I have to choose. I'm like, I don't want to choose. And so I'm like, I'm just going to stay out of the debate, which is impossible to do. So it's kind of part of the taking the cross and going down forth into the night.
I love that idea of, being responsible with this, which is, challenging to grapple with. And I think we've all had a lot to think about there. And maybe that kind of flows into our next question, which we'll start to move into our directed questions. This one is for Aliya, then Wendy, then Rachel. In your research, how easy or difficult has it been to incorporate feminist theories with quantitative empirical research? And any examples you could provide would be great. So starting with Aliya.
How's the time to spill the tea? I think, I mean, much like we all described in our answers to the first question, there have been easy moments, but certainly the difficult ones are easy. They come to mind more quickly. And I think choosing the audience has been a challenge. Are you talking, you know, in my case, am I talking to demographers? Am I talking to stratification scholars? Am I talking to gender scholars? Am I trying to find a venue in which somehow magically I can talk to all three of them at the same time? And I think after I found the community in demography at Berkeley, I think that was a really unique community, perhaps at the time, in that they were really open to these kinds of methods. I mean, I think they thought I was kind of quaint and interesting, but they weren't unopen to the idea. They were like, yeah, sure, try it out. I don't know what's going to happen, but so I think it wasn't so much finding a welcome audience in graduate school and at conferences. It was more trying to choose journals, for example, like where are you going to try to publish? And it does seem like this is easier to publish in, say, Gender and Society than in stratification journals. And maybe we got some of that signal very early on. I remember I've done a bunch of joint work on race with Andrew Penner, and we were just finishing up graduate school, and he was going to present our work. We had a poster, and he was going to go present our work at a Strat conference. And I think we had the word intersectionality in the title. And a more senior scholar came up to him and said, "Oh, I see you've drunk the Kool-Aid."
Oh.
And that was the reaction to presenting a poster with a so-called intersectional analysis. And I mean, certainly we got the message like, oh, I guess we're sending this paper to Gender and Society, then like it's not going to be welcome at a stratification venue. I've also been, when I started to work on measurement of gender in surveys, my colleagues accused me of trying to break the surveys, literally using the word, you're going to break the surveys. Which I was like, wait, why would I do that? I need the data. It's not going to do me any good to break the survey. But I do think, I've never been one to take no for an answer. And I think there's many of us, including probably all of us on this call, who are not those kind of people. And so we've persisted. And I do think the tide does seem to be turning, and more of us are getting into positions of power where we get to make the decisions about what gets published, and we get to make the decisions about what data gets collected. And so I'm very excited for what the future looks like in that respect.
Wendy, your thoughts, and Rachel.
I feel like I'm always being the negative Eeyore type person when I'm thinking about answers to these questions. So I'm going to apologize for that in advance. I think the biggest obstacle has been the review process, and it's related to what I said in my answer to the first question, because a lot of knowledge about feminist theory hasn't become mainstream, and because there seems to be an acceptance about what kind of research questions are appropriate to ask and what methods are appropriate to use, it's very difficult to try and introduce new methods which are better aligned with feminist theories, because people don't want to invest the time to think about why they're more appropriate, to think about issues of alignment, much less some of the ethical issues to do with the epistemology of predominant research questions, which frequently are about how we get people to do what we want, which I think isn't a very feminist methodology. If we think of a feminist methodology as something which holds us accountable as researchers, asking questions about how we can explain why people use contraception, or if we examine why whether children whose parents divorce are worse off, often the implicit assumption is that you can do something to change people's behavior rather than look for structural issues. And in my mind, those obstacles have really made it very difficult to sort of get the message across, because you have to do so much preliminary work just to build those bridges in order to have those conversations, that it means that you end up having to present your papers at conferences for a long time and really struggle with reviewers who are like, well, assuming that the question that you're answering must be causal, because, you know, the only question that's worth asking and the only finding that's worth finding is some causal relationship, and causal inference still seems to be something that people are really attached to. And all of those things kind of come together alongside a lack of appreciation for the limitations of the methods and the assumptions that underpin them, that make it very difficult to really affect the kind of change I would like. I promise to try and be more optimistic the next question.
So I absolutely agree with the comments that both Aliya and Wendy were making about gatekeeping and about publication as a site of that we need to think about more. And I think it's in both directions. So I think both feminist publication spaces and also quantitative or normatively quantitative publication spaces are slightly problematic. And one of the things that we see in both, you know, some of it's just this, you know, who do you get for reviewers? Who are your normal reviewers? Feminist publications don't have many quantitative reviewers, and quantitative publications don't have many feminist reviewers. And that just means that you are unlikely to be being read by somebody who shares both of those attributes. And there are then other things about the norms of the ways in which publications are produced and what's expected to be in them that comes around to word limit. So, for example, reflexivity is very unusual in quantitative publications, as people have said. It's, you know, and they might be, it's okay if you've got a methodological paper, you can have reflexivity, but not if you've got some findings. Similarly, you know, in sort of more feminist spaces, you know, complex quantitative analyses are seen as just like not going to appeal to the readership, and there's a resistance there. And so in both directions, and what you see is, for example, when we did, again, years ago now, but when we looked at where in sort of journals that came under the sort of gender/feminist sort of remit, people were publishing quantitative things, it was overwhelmingly in gender journals, not in explicitly feminist journals. When people wrote quantitative things, they didn't use the language of feminism very much, even if they were transformative. So even if the object was, we could suggest feminist in that they were looking to change the world, as Wendy highlights, you know, they weren't necessarily doing it with the sort of language or the reflexivity that you might expect within a feminist publication. And so you see these sort of tensions between the different spaces. That said, I mean, I think there are other issues. There's issues, for example, in my research, I'm really interested in sorts of forms of non-standard work. I've written about sex work. Sex work stats are terrible. You know, we have some amount of data on a few parts of them, but, you know, it's just so we think about, again, the parts of gendered lives that are, are not very easily subject to quantitative analysis are also interesting questions and sort of problems about where, and, you know, that's why some of us just end up doing mixed methods, because it's a compromise. It's a way of getting some of those things. And so I think it's, yeah, so I guess I don't think that's very good empirical examples, but certainly I think some of the things that people were talking about earlier around the ways in which data is expanding and the different kinds of data are the places in which I guess I think it's been, you know, there has been the most progress. And, you know, both around, you know, how we understand gender, but also about, you know, our gendered lives and those and intersectionality and the kinds of possibilities to study different groups of people in, you know, different spaces. So sorry, that's very broad still, but yeah.
No, I mean, there's so many things to say about it, and certainly the point around tension very much resonates with me in my own work. I've found in a lot of spaces, because I'm kind of working across different disciplines. I've been in economic spaces where I'm seen as way too feminist for them, and I've been in feminist spaces where I'm way too quantitative, and in social science in general, I'm way too much of an economist. So there's so many points of tension there for sure. Another question for the group. This will be for Alyasah, Jaclyn, Marion, and Aliya. What are some of the ways in which feminist quantitative research has thus far incorporated an intersectional or anti-racist lens? What are ways in which it's been done well? What are the ways that we can all do better in this regard? So Alyasah, we'll start with you.
You know, it's honestly a really great question, and it's going to be a question that I'm going to answer for the rest of my career. I'll focus on the optimistic part of it. I think I work within a space of trying to capture this race, ethnicity, immigration, and gender and sexuality nexus. And the primary thing we deal with is a sampling issue. It's the oversampling of white women, the undersampling of immigrant women, of indigenous women, Black and brown women. And it means that you cannot use the standards of nationally representative data to find us. We are hyper marginalized, we are vulnerable, we are hard to reach. So on one hand, I really appreciate the newer methods within research on racism and race to do an intersectional multi-level design. And then I pull back and say, do you actually have the numbers to test each of those differences across the groups? And oftentimes they don't. On the other hand, so I appreciate the design, and then the follow through is less comforting. On the other hand, I'm involved with a research project, the National LGBTQ+ Women's Community Survey, where we started off saying we want to do an intersectional sampling design. In order to do that, we already were like, we're not going to be representative of anything, primarily because we don't know where people are. So part of this survey is a first stab at creating a sampling design to find people who are marginalized by gender and sexuality, and also by race and class. And the problem that you run into is exactly what you're getting at. It is, we've been in the project for more than 15 months, and we still have really, really small numbers of Black and brown women and other women of color. And at this point in time, you're like, so do you just stop? Do you just accept that we have, in some sense, failed? And, I push back against that. I design a quota sample, which by default is going to introduce design problems because you're in the field for longer. But the reality is the way that you're finding people is categorically different. It took us 5 to 6 months before we started to get a critical mass of Black and brown women. We have a sample that has been translated in Spanish, which only out of 8,000 women, only 25 folks have taken it. That's not just a problem on our end. It's a problem on the ground. And I do think this is where we as feminists have to work with racism scholars to come to what almost is invariably an impasse, right? But that doesn't mean we don't start there, right? So I think there's a question of standards we need to, on reporting this data, I think they need to be publicized. And I think in some sense, we need to start to agree upon them.
Jaclyn, go ahead.
So I actually think that Alyasah's work is like the model for what I consider to be intersectional feminist quant research. I see it as an approach to designing research in the first place, shaping the questions that we ask and the methods that we choose, all the way up to interpreting our empirical results. So I think something that I would like to see moving forward with intersectional feminist quantitative research is, even when we're looking at populations that are privileged and advantaged, like, we need to use that lens of intersectionality to see how structures of privilege and oppression are working to create advantages and privileges, and not just working to create advantages or disadvantages and marginalization.
Marion, your thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to echo a bit further the part about sampling, and how, like, I think sampling design is actually, like, it's a very strong limitation for intersectional analysis. I think that's like one of the most common thing you come across it immediately, right? Like, as soon as you try to use survey data or any kind of data. And maybe just to expand a little bit more on the idea, I think even in cases where you have surveys that are designed specifically with oversampling, to oversample, for instance, ethnic minority or migrants and descendants of migrants, I think it's really worth paying attention to how these oversample designs are done. Because, so for instance, if you think about what you need to do intersectional analysis of, like, say, migration, right? And you want to be, that means you would need to be able to compare, for instance, white migrant women and non-white migrant women to understand a little bit what's happening. And because of the way very often the oversample design are done, they oversample people who combine a lot of markers of otherness. So they're going to be simultaneously non-white and migrants, typically, right? Because that's it's an economical way to do oversample design. And actually that gets in the way of doing the kind of analysis that we need to do, because you do need this these other categories as well. I think that comes across a lot, and it actually comes down to the fact that at the point where we decide that we're going to do an oversample design, actually we're not at the point where that decision is made, it's not meant for intersectional analysis. It's meant for research on ethnic minority, chiefly on integration. And so then they want to know, mainly they're interested in like non-white migrants or descendants of migrants. So like that's the sort of thing that I think we could kind of push a bit effectively, and also we haven't yet really done that. And in the field of computational social science, there's like it's a very different kind of issue, and there's a lot to be done, because I think feminist theory has permeated that field even less. But at the moment, to be honest, the main thing I would say is that we've got a bit of tokenization, where like we have a couple of isolated feminist computational social scientists, and you might be asked to do like the one chapter on gender inequality in the whatever handbook, but it's a very it's very framed. It's like it has to be understood by an audience that knows nothing about feminist theory. I don't think that reflects a general, like a big engagement of the field, and more of a like, we should talk about gender and we're gonna let you do that.
It's kind of thrown in, yeah. Aliya, your thoughts.
Everything that everyone said resonates a lot. And I think one of the things that I struggle with in my own teaching is where to tell people to start. And I think we've been talking, especially Alyasah highlighted, we've got big problems with sampling. We've got big problems with how we design our surveys. And those problems are too big for a beginning graduate student to tackle. And so I feel like this constant tension of like, do we tell you everything that's wrong, or do we tell you the little things that you can do to start moving the needle a little bit? And I think we need to do a bit of both, that we need to make people aware that, we don't have the solutions. Like our models are ahead of our data, which is one way that I would summarize what Alyasah said earlier. I love what people are doing with multi-level modeling, with including structural variables to take account of structural racism and sexism. I think all of these things are so important, and that we need to keep doing them and make sure that they stay included in our big data set, so that they are more available to everyone widely. But at the same time, I think we need to pay attention to the tiny little ways that we can be anti-racist and intersectional in our work. And those include things as simple as, what is your reference group and why? Why are you coding your variable? Should you be coding it as a white, non-white binary? Should you be, why are you making these very small decisions, but decisions that actually have a lot of consequences for the way that you interpret your findings and the way that they end up being seen and sold to other people. So I would love to see us, pay attention we kind of need to keep an eye on both registers, the big stuff that we need to fix, but also the little things that we can teach people who are coming up, so that once the data is ready, they are prepared. They have all the little things in line that they already know how to do and already know how to fix. So that when we do have this wonderful data that we all want and need, that the next cohorts coming up will be prepared to use it wisely.
And we do have a question coming up on teaching, so we'll learn more about that then. But for now, shifting, I guess, more to looking forward, and we're kind of naturally moving in that direction. A question for Jaclyn and Wendy. How well do you think feminist quantitative researchers incorporate reflexivity and positionality in our work? And how can we improve moving forward? I know a few folks have touched on this before, but I'd love to hear more. Jaclyn, over to you.
Yeah, it does not seem common to engage in reflexivity or acknowledge our social positions in quantitative research. And I think that hampers transparency in the research process. And I think that when we don't lay out how we made our decisions and how our positions might have influenced our decisions and potentially how else we could have done an analysis, all those little coding decisions, all those little micro decisions about like how we cut our sample and how we, created our data sets and things like that. I think that detracts from how much I trust in the resulting analysis and the interpretation. And I think that we need to have more of that transparency and more of engagement in reflexivity to really be doing feminist research where we are acknowledging where we're coming from and we're giving you, as much information as is needed for the reader then to interpret and understand and see how these findings might be really contextualized, within the way that we conducted this research, and that there are possibilities for other ways that things could have turned out.
And Wendy, what do you think?
I don't see a whole lot of reflexivity and positionality reflected in feminist quantitative research, and I think in part that's probably because it isn't encouraged in many of the mainstream journals, and it doesn't make it through the review process. And I think that is really unfortunate, because good reflexivity, I would also say, I think sometimes reflexivity and positionality is a knee-jerk response in some feminist literature, where I learn about the biography of the person doing the research, not their engagement with the research. And I want to see more of people scrutinizing the research in an ethically accountable way for the assumptions that they're replicating because of their disciplinary training, their social location. And I want to see people more attentive to how there is a gap between documenting gaps. So much quantitative research is about showing gaps. And so much of interpretation of gaps comes from the positionality of the researcher. And I think integrating considerations of political intersectionality, representational intersectionality, if you go back to Crenshaw's mapping the margins, you are given a whole lot of material to think about what you're doing as a researcher. And I think the possibility is there, but the encouragement isn't. And this probably links back to training, teaching people about, underdetermination in empirical evidence, and how researchers are interpreting what they see, not just seeing something that's self-evident. And if I can just add on something which is kind of related to what people said in answer to the previous question, I think we also need to be very accountable for how we use and interpret control variables. There's a tendency to try and explain away gaps by including control variables. And control variables are frequently interpreted with reference to the largest group in the sample. And if you introduce a control variable that means different things across different groups, you end up not explaining gaps, but introducing bias as the dummies that represent your gaps adjust to accommodate for the differences across control variables, and not attending to how we use distal measures of the things we're trying to get at, rather than very close measures and valid measures of the structural inequalities we want to get at, in ways that basically just keep replicating the patterns that we observe amongst the largest, most dominant groups in our data. And thinking about those things as you're designing research is, I think, hugely important.
Absolutely. So one of the ways we need to think about looking forward, and has been already brought up a few times, is about teaching and thinking about kind of the new generation of scholars coming up. So question for Rachel, then Alyasah, then Marion. How could we better incorporate feminist quantitative research in undergrad and master's level teaching moving forward? And any examples that you have to share with the group would be very appreciated. Rachel, you are up first.
Thanks. I think it's hard, and it's some of the same things that we talked about when we were talking about journals and publishing spaces, in that teaching spaces are also segregated. A lot of us work in institutions in which, or in subject areas where there's a sort of real deficit model around quantitative skills. There's usually a limited number of people who are the quantitative people in the department and do all of the quantitative teaching. It's skill focused. It's about encouraging and cajoling people to not hate it and to get involved and to do something. And so there's this real trepidation then about like delegitimizing it, and as well, which exacerbates the desire to retain the truthiness of it, and to not start saying, oh, well, but these categories are actually, we have to unpick them and start reflecting on them, and etc. So there's a real tension around the actual just day-to-day ways in which you have to work around teaching quantitative methods in specific spaces. And conversely, I think we've got generations of feminist scholars who were not used to teaching quantitative things. And so in feminist research methods, training is often really interesting, really exciting, really philosophical, really reflexive, but it isn't necessarily so skills focused in the same way, and so there becomes this then tension. And I often find that some of the most critical feminists are the best at explaining why they shouldn't be studying quantitative methods, and that's great, like, to have the critique, but you actually want them to have, you need to have both the skills and the critique in order to move forward. And so there's a real tension, and I think, hopefully, like, as more of everyone on this panel, hopefully everybody in here start getting involved, so that there isn't the quantitative person or the feminist person. There are multiple. It becomes much more easy to start having those conversations. But I think we also have to think about, how do you combine different kinds of training within education, and that skill stuff, which matters, but also needs to be deconstructed, and we need to have that philosophical transformative focus as well, where you're thinking not just about what you're doing and how to do it, but the ends of what you're doing. So I think that there's potential, but it does really require, it's not something that's easy, and there's some reasons why it doesn't happen.
So this is my baby when it comes to approaches to research. I probably would have dropped out of graduate school if I hadn't found a class at ICP Sara on how to quantify race and ethnicity. And when I got to the class, I was like, this is trash. So within a couple of years, I was like, I kept pushing folks, hey, let's do this. And eventually they let me do it. And so I learned a lot about how to teach, about quantifying critical topics without understanding in the fact that they're just like at a quantitative level, just like questions around feminism, around intersectionality. So there was an acceptance for 50, 60 years of research on race and ethnicity. Okay, now we know. I can't point to 50, 60 years of research on feminism, sex and gender that has that same level of critical engagement. Number one, because people don't want to put the money behind it. So I, on my own, have been developing this class that you can broadly think about as methods of social problems. And it was geared towards graduate students. And I'm like, y'all are right. You have to start earlier than that. You have to start in undergrad. And so to take this question of complexity and boil it down to what you can teach, essentially a second year college student who needs to know everything. It is a delicate topic. And I have two solutions. One, I was like, you know what, I'll teach the stats class. Not having the experience of teaching basic statistics, I had always taught this specific question around inequities. And so I have to go relearn, okay, how do you talk about just everybody? And one of the things that came up in doing this kind of question was, number one, the question of data equity, which we have all talked about, the examples that people use in these classes, what is a control group, this idea that you're actually introducing bias into the sample by controlling for things, even when you can't see it. That's a responsibility now. I'm like, you know what, y'all gonna learn this from the beginning. And so I actually think that the intervention that I can make the strongest way within quantitative research is to teach to people before they know anything from the foundation. If you do quantitative work, you should always be aligned with intersectional approaches, with feminist approaches, with anti-racist approaches, with indigenous approaches, and to the point where it's just standard. Then in the next generation, we won't be having this conversation because there'll be many of us who are trained to have these conversations and versed in different ways to do it.
Yeah, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I mean, I teach in a methodology department, right? So my students come from all departments and like all social science departments. And actually very few of them come from gender studies or sociology. So like in that context, like already just having examples and exercises that engage with feminist research question, like that's, you already come across as a bit of a trailblazer. Like most of the exercises that we have are about cricket and, like weird questions that aren't really about humans. That's the sort of stage we're at in this kind of environment for quantitative teaching. I think the part, like actually as soon as you start talking about feminist research questions, about intersectionality, about gender inequality, about all sorts of things like that, like students really engage with it. They're really interested in it. It's not difficult. At least in my experience, it's not a bit difficult to create a certain degree of enthusiasm, even in social data science programs where theoretically they're like miles away, right? Sex and gender is nowhere near the agenda. I think at least one thing that we try to do, I'm not the only one in my department who try to push for like a slightly different way of teaching, of integrating feminist quant methods and so on. We put a lot of emphasis on data and categories as proxies, of like really forcing that conversation that if you scrape data from a social media platform, from an online website of any sort, a survey data, what you're working with are proxies. They're never like a reality in the real world, right? Like it's a better or lesser proxy. You can make a case that it's a better proxy rather than a horrible one, but it's still going to be a proxy, and you got to engage with that. And then we push a lot for students to think about why we have that data, who ordained it, who paid for it, why did they want that data, whether it's online or it's a survey. And like when we get students to think through that, we have really fascinating conversations with them. And it might not be explicitly feminist. We don't make it like specific to feminist research question, but I think in its process, it is a feminist approach. And it's one that I think they resonate quite well with.
Great. Certainly lots to think about, hopefully for the audience to take away to your own work and your own courses for anyone who's teaching right now. So I have one final question, and this is hopefully a fun one for the panel before we move into our Q&A, and this will be for all of our panelists. What topics or avenues of research have thus far been underexplored by feminist quantitative approaches, and how can we as a group of scholars address that? And in particular, I'd love to know, what about these areas do you find exciting? What are you really excited about with that? We will start with Heini.
Thank you. So I feel like there probably remains more open questions and more things that are underexplored than the ones that are already resolved. I mean, have we resolved anything? So I feel like I need to tackle this from my angle, which is kind of a social demographer, so like sexual and reproductive health person. So demography as a discipline lacks theory, and I feel like we shouldn't. Maybe we should be using some theory. And since we're not using much right now, why not start using feminist theory? I would really like to see feminist demography develop. And I hope that could be in terms of theory as well as topics, and the kind of like maybe seeing the different kinds of methods, a more wide range of methods used than what we have currently, what we currently have in demography. It could also mean that we always incorporate intersectionality in our research. And I think this would be very exciting, but in order for this to actually happen, I think we would need a critical mass of people doing this. I think there are some individuals who are doing things like that, but I feel like we need to kind of come together as a collective and make this happen. I think more generally in social scientists, what we could do is maybe look into mixed methods a bit more. I think Rachel mentioned this earlier as a compromise, but I think it can also be a really nice way of keeping our quantitative methods alive, keeping our categories fluid, and making sure that we are kind of going across the different methodological divides and trying to kind of understand all sides and collaborate across divides.
Jaclyn, how about you? What direction would you like to see us going?
So I guess I'm wondering if a feminist quantitative approach can more seriously include descriptive statistics. I think that we really elevate, statistical significance tests and causal inference, as was mentioned. And I feel like that kind of crowds out additional ways of knowing, like what can we learn by just simply looking descriptively at our data, and what can we learn by not throwing out that data that it has the small n problem? What can we do when we have, some of our surveys include open-ended kind of qualitative text responses? Like, what if we took those seriously? And what if we approach that data as kind of an invitation for us to explore future directions of research, right? Like maybe these are small ends now, but maybe that is a reason for us to collect more data on that population to really understand what is going on there. Like maybe we take some of these text responses seriously as a way for understanding how people understand their own social worlds that maybe the researcher has just not picked up on yet. And so I think that, maybe this mixed methods approach could be super generative for advancing our quantitative research moving forward.
Absolutely. Wendy, what do you think?
I'm going to slightly disagree with Heini, because I don't think it's possible to do a theoretical research. I think demographers frequently say they don't use theory as a way of not holding themselves accountable for the implicit theory that's aligned with the methods that they use. And I think the most exciting area for a theoretical quantitative people to move into is to adopt what Carol Bacchi has called a consciousness turned in upon itself. What is it possible to think as a researcher? What implicit assumptions underpin the methods that you're using, the methods that you've been taught to use? If you look at cross-national comparative methods, there's a whole lot of assumptions about what variables mean. And even when you do multi-level models, what the random effects are doing and what they're actually controlling for. So the whole idea of what the data generating process is that underpins those cross-national comparisons carries a whole lot of assumptions about uniform trajectories of development, which have been discredited a long time ago. And figuring out how methods that were developed at a time when there were very problematic conceptual frameworks and bringing those two things together, I think has a huge potential for actually identifying areas that are desperately in need of change. And for me, that's the most exciting avenue that I see going forward.
Aliya, what are your thoughts on the topic?
When I think about, and maybe this is somewhat like what Wendy was saying, when I think about what I find most exciting, it is also what I find most terrifying, which is, what is the next concept that we need to unpack? So I think when I think of feminist demography, I think of, the original critique of the nature of the household head and the way that we were counting households and who got to be the head and all of the associated gendering that was attached to that. And, I feel like we sort of started there, and we've now moved on to questioning the measurement of sex and gender themselves and sexuality, which is obviously I find incredibly important. But then I'm forced to ask, and when I do my own work, I'm forced to ask, well, what's next? What am I missing? What are my blind spots? Am I going to end up on the wrong side of history because there's something that I'm not paying attention to? And maybe this goes back to the conversation about reflexivity and positionality as well. But there's always this pressure, this concern when you're proposing new techniques and new measures. What is it going to be right? Is it going to be a good direction to go in? But at the same time that it's terrifying, it's exciting too, because it does allow us to imagine an alternative future and to help bring that future into being. And, I don't want to be naive. This all takes an incredible amount of work and money and collaboration and all of those things. But I think starting with those thoughts and then having a group like this that helps precisely by making space for these kinds of conversations, that just makes me the most excited about what's next.
I think excitement and terror sometimes are two sides of the same coin when you're charting uncharted territory, I should say. Alyasah, what do you think? What direction would you like to see things go in?
So yeah, I'll do two. Number one, I actually think we really need to formally test the design effect issue, and because it's never going to be something we can escape. Given, for instance, in my case, in studying marginality by the expression of sexuality and gender, you're by definition going to have small groups. That doesn't mean you throw them out. I think you get better at this question around description, but changing the standards from description to ones that don't rely on causal assumptions. What does that mean? I can give you 5 ways to test it. Why can't we do that? It's not outside of our domain to do that. The way in which I came into this conversation is actually thinking about gender variant, non-gender conforming trans populations, and being forced to say, okay, what does it mean to be trans? Okay, look at your sex at birth and how you identify. That is like actually not the only way to do this. And if you actually think about how people use pronouns, the ways in which people express their gender, you can find a much larger trans population than what we theoretically expect, even among feminists. And so I think there are efforts to do this question. I don't think that we take, in my mind, when it comes to substantive inferences, I don't think we take the question of design effects with quantitative work seriously enough to actually center these things as formally methodological problems. It's not just about this is the population. If you don't understand this population itself, queer populations, non-binary populations, they're so diverse in everything else. So to say and boil it down to that identity, which I do think is calling on identity politics, it's actually non-feminist. And so I think we have to have these questions around the under exploration of our own identities. And it's our responsibility to ourselves to do that. And the comments that Wendy you've made is just like, it's hitting me so hard because I think we need to reaffirm this question of what a control group is, why you should do a control group, and the ways in which bench science ways of thinking about it is what we understand as control groups. But what if we thought about it through the social feminist lens of what a quote unquote group differences could do when it's a reflection of status and power? And so I walk with that conversation and think about this much more concretely around the theory of methodology itself, or statistical methodology.
Thank you. Marion, what are your thoughts?
Sorry. So, I mean, I find all of this incredibly interesting, and I agree with basically all of it. I'm going to try to add something that is more specifically about what I can maybe bring to this conversation, which is the computational angle. There's no doubt that there's a lot that can be done in that direction, in the sense that this question of how is gender, like gender identities, but also like gender roles, gendered labor, how is all of this being translated and also like exploited in online environments and through online mediation? And I don't mean that's a really important question, and I don't mean only in the sense, like, I think a lot of computational research and digital research tends to focus a lot on discourse and text analysis, and that is important, but I don't mean only in the way that people talk to each other. I mean literally in the way that people obtain work, the kind of work they can get, the kind of social protection they have access to, and so on and so forth. I think that is actually the question of platform labor in particular is very important for intersectionality, because we know that platform work is overwhelmingly undertaken by migrant workers, ethnic minority workers, and in the areas that I focus on, which is platform mediated domestic and care labor, we're looking at overwhelmingly migrant women and ethnic minority women. And this is a transformation of how is domestic labor and how is care labor provided in the relation between employers and employees and so on. And it also gives a lot of powers to these platforms. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for feminist quant research, not only because there's skills involved in getting that data and analyzing it, but also because we face very active resistance from platform managers when we try to apply feminist participatory methods. So typically, I think, and my understanding of like feminist research practices was, as much as you can, walk, unmasked, right? Like engage with people, explain what you're doing, try to involve them. And I found that when you try to do that in the context of care platform or domestic platforms, and you reach out to platform explaining what you're trying to do, you get a wall, because they know that what they've created is a huge platform of underemployment for especially migrant ethnic minority people, and especially women. And like, I mean, even like legally, right? Like I have this whole CEO who told us that if we tried to scrape their data at all with whatever limitation, they would sue us. And so that had to go all the way to like LSE legal, and we don't know whether that's going to be a thing. So the question of data monopoly and this power struggle, I think is quite pressing. And it really makes me think a lot about what I'm trying to do when I want to do feminist, like digital feminist research. Does that mean I want to involve my participants, but do I then ignore the gatekeepers? How do I get to my participants when they're like people on platforms, and actually ethically, maybe I shouldn't reach out to them for something other than offering them work? Yeah, so I think for feminists, that I find that very exciting and very challenging, both the reflection about methods and also the fact that we really need to study this labor, I think, in the context of intersectional inequalities.
And Rachel, what directions are exciting for you?
I feel like I'm following up on lots of things that people have said, but I think I've got two big points to make, I guess. And the first one is really about the sort of tension between a transformative agenda and an analysis that recognizes both complexity and social connection. And I think that a lot of what Jaclyn was saying at the start around descriptive statistics is really resonant if you're thinking about a transformative agenda, where what you say, and as feminists, you want what you say to be understood, to be explicable, to be part of, you know, campaign material. And simple data is the thing that is often the most resonant in those spaces. But at the same time, you know, we need to move away from understanding, you know, doing analysis of isolates, you know, individual, you know, comparing these individuals as if they have disconnection. And obviously there are methods, some people have talked about them already, whether those are multi-level modeling, whether you think about network analysis, whether, you know, other kinds of ways of thinking about how to study connectivity and relationships between people, to move away from thinking about just comparing bunches of individuals as if they are somehow bunches of individuals who have no connection, because we want to be able to look at, you know, you want to think about them as part of social spaces, as interconnected, whether through relationships of power or collegiality, whatever. And I think that, and I don't know the answer to this at all, but I think that we need to think about how do we manage that, because we want to be able to talk to people, we want people to hear us, but we also want to think about the complexity. And I don't know if it is around, you know, yeah. So that's just like, that's a big, I don't know how to do it. My other big question really comes and follows off from a lot of what Marion was saying, which is really about when we don't want to be counted and when we resist counting and quantification. And I think that is a really important feminist question. It's a question about where counting isolates people, where counting gives power to the powerful. It's, you know, whether those are platform employers, whether those are, you know, employers who are tracking people through wearables, or counting migrant workers and what they do. We know that. And I think it's important that if you're taking a feminist perspective to quantification, that you think about what quantification does in the social world, not just in the academic space. And thinking about that is, I think, a really interesting, terrifying, all of those things proposition, but it's definitely not something we should be quiet about. And it's, you know, we don't necessarily always want to reveal everybody, you know, whether that means because you don't want to out people, because you don't want to provide information about people that can be exploited. And I think it's just, that is a really, really big issue and it's not just about small sample sizes, it's about who has data, who has knowledge, and who controls that. So on the one hand, yes, as feminists, we all have to have the capacity, and that's why, like, feminists being involved in quantum methods is absolutely essential, but it also means sometimes resisting them.